In this video, we will break down the full creation process of this little fantasy reptile, which I made completely in Blender. We will start with my concept development process, then go over the techniques I use for sculpting, retopology, UV mapping, rigging, texture painting, and we will finish up by analyzing how I set up the final scenes. Hi everyone, my name is Masha and I'm a 3D artist. Welcome to my channel, and now let's get started. This project was something I wanted to do for a long time now, in order to test out the knowledge I accumulated about creature design and see if I could create a nice looking fantasy animal. And since I love reptiles and already have some confidence with creating them, I decided that making a fantasy reptile would be a good start point. To make a believable creature concept, having good theory basis is something really helpful. What I personally did to improve from this point of view is studying the subject through courses and books about creature design and animal anatomy. I especially recommend this course by Austin Batchelor and of course the books by Terrell Whitlatch. She also has a course about creature anatomy on Sculpting.com. Of course, that's not all. If you search online, I'm sure you will find tons of courses and study material about these topics. And in general, being interested in creatures and constantly observing them whenever we can also can help a lot. So, how did I come up with the concept? One of the first things you learn about creature design is that the best way to come up with a good concept is to base it on creatures we have in the real world. So the first step for me was to create a board on Pinterest with the most fascinating reptiles I could find around the internet. Once I did that, I started to think about which ones I would love to use as the basis of my creature. The species I chose was this unpronounceable name frog, crested gecko, and a common basilisk, so that would be the basis. I also wanted to add a few strange looking elements that could make sense with a reptile body shape. So I decided to add a glowing hook, like the one of some deep ocean fishes, and some tree-like shapes like the ones we can see in some seahorses. Once I had the idea in my head, I made a quick sketch just to give myself a general idea of how to combine these shapes together. Please don't judge my sketching skills! After that, I started to create a pure ref board with more detailed references where I could observe the species I picked from as many angles as possible. As you can see, I also collected some general anatomy images to better understand the body shapes. Once I had the sketch and the references, I started the project by blocking out a very simple base mesh using simple modeling and the skin modifier. Once I was happy with the proportions of the base mesh, I started to sculpt the general shapes, keeping the elements separate from each other, so I could still scale them or move them easily if I wanted. This was especially useful with the front limbs, since in the frog species I choose to use as basis for the body, they joined to the body in a weird way. For this reason, I had to move them around a bit before being sure that they looked fine. Once I was okay with the basic shapes, I was ready to start joining the elements together and dive a bit more into details. In these sculpting stages, I go with the remesh workflow where you basically sculpt your meshes, and once you see that the subdivisions are not enough, you use the remesh tool to add more. Something I like a lot of this technique is that you can change your mesh shapes quite drastically and add the subdivisions you need without losing things like masks and face sets. Masks and face sets are quite important for me in this stage, since I use them a lot to isolate some elements or body parts and sculpt or transform them separately from the rest of the mesh. Once I felt that all the body shapes were defined and I was sure that I don't want to add or remove anything that would drastically change my mesh silhouette, I was ready to go to the next stage. One would expect the next stage to be adding the skin details, but nope. I need a properly retopologized mesh first, since for the details stage I use the Multires workflow. We'll see later how it works. I started with the areas I was most concerned about, the little tree-like shapes on the back. I didn't absolutely want to make them all manually, since that would take forever. So after trying out different options, I found that the best way would be to create some face sets for these parts, hide everything else, mask them, and then use mask extract to create a copy mesh. Then I use the quad remesher add-on to remesh that area automatically. It's quite easy to use. You just select the mesh you want to retopologize, set the resolution, and click on remesh it button. Unfortunately, it's not free, but it's the tool that gave me the best results. You can download it and try it out for 30 days for free. Otherwise, you can go with the techniques showed by Zach in this video about Retopology. The workflow he shows uses only free tools and it still speeds up the whole thing. So once I was done with that part, I switched to the classic Retopology workflow with the help of some add-ons shipped with Blender. As base setup, I used shrink wrap modifier and snap set to face project to snap the Retopology geometry to the high-res mesh. I started the process by defining the main loops. For this part, I helped myself with the piece surfaces tool and then switched to the classic modeling techniques, extrude, subdivide, fill, etc. to connect all the main loops together. In this second phase, I also joined the handmade Retopology mesh with the automatically remeshed part, since initially they were two separate meshes. Once done with Retopology, I applied the mirror modifier and double-checked my mesh to make sure there weren't any holes or hang-ons. This stage is very important because if you change your base geometry in edit mode after sculpting the details with the Multires modifier, the mesh might go crazy like so, and you might need to resculpt some of them, or even worse, you might need to start the details from scratch. So check the mesh very carefully. Anyway, once I was sure that everything was fine, I added Multires modifier to the low-res retopologized mesh and used the shrink wrap modifier to store all the nice details information from the high poly mesh inside it. Once you add shrink wrap to your scene, you also might see some glitches. Don't ignore them, they might mean that some parts of your retopology mesh have holes or are too far away from or too close to the original sculpture, or have inverted normals. Fix the problems that cause the glitches, and once everything looks fine, apply the shrink wrap modifier. This will tell Blender to store all that nice details inside the Multires modifier. Once I had all the high-res details inside the Multires modifier, I added some skin details to my creature. For some spots, like around the mouth, I did it manually by using masks and the inflate mesh filter. I basically drew the scales with the mask tool and then used inflate to give them a 3D shape. For others, I used some texture brushes I found inside the Blender Kit add-on. When I felt like all the details were done and there was nothing to add anymore, I switched to the UV mapping and unwrapping stage. A quick note here, I had some problems with Blender crashing while working in edit mode with Multires modifier on the mesh, even if turned off. Haven't really figured out if this is something that happens just to me or if it's a general issue. I found a workaround for that by simply doing the unwrapping on a copy of my retopologized mesh without the Multires modifier and then copying it to the one with Multires by using the data transfer modifier. Anyway, next time I would definitely do the UVs before the Multires detail sculpting stage. Since I wanted a bit more resolution for the textures, I decided to use UDIMS. The UDIMS workflow allows you to expand the UV tiles to more than one, and in this way use multiple textures in a lower resolution for your mesh instead of one big high-res image. For example, in this case I used 2 tiles, which allowed me to work with 2 6K images instead of one 12K, which could slow down my computer in the texture painting stage. In this way I can have the same resolution with better performance. In my case, splitting the textures in 2 images were enough, but if you have a less performant computer that, let's say, starts slowing down with 2K resolution textures already, you might need to split your UVs in more UDIM tiles. By the way, I know the gaps between my UV islands are a bit too big. That's my problem. Whenever I try to make them smaller, I always have this feeling that they're overlapping. We'll talk about this with my therapist and try to overcome this paranoia for my next project. I promise. Once the UVs were done, I baked the Multires details into a normal and a displacement map. Now, Blender is able to automatically bake textures by using detected UDIM tiles, and you need just one little extra step to make it work. As you would normally do, add a material and set up a new image. Now, set it to UDIM tiles, select the new image inside the image editor, then add the tiles you need from the side panel. Bring the viewport Multires subdivisions to 0 and the render subdivisions to the max value, and you're ready to go. When the baking is done and you save your textures, Blender will automatically add UDIM tiles numbers to each image. With the baking done, I was ready for the texturing phase. What I generally do when I create textures for a creature is using the displacement map as basis to create multiple color variations with color ramp, and then split them with a black and white mask that I paint over the mesh. This is a bit longer to set up and a bit more complicated than simple texture painting directly with colors, but it gives you the possibility to modify the color layers whenever you want and create many different color variations without having to paint anything from scratch. This is something you can use, of course, not only to split colors, but also to split different materials. For example, here I have 2 different materials combined together. One is for the mouth and the second one is for the body. I could of course have used another one for emissive areas, but in this case, plugging a mask inside the emission value of principled BSDF was enough for what I needed. Once I was done with the textures, I needed to bake them into simple PBR maps so that my presentation render scenes wouldn't be too heavy. That's because Blender won't have to calculate all the layers interactions to give you the final result, so the viewport performance and the rendering will be much faster in this way. Also, since the PBR maps are universal for most softwares, if I want, I can export my model outside Blender for use in other 3D tools, and the textures will work perfectly fine. For this, I don't like to use the regular Blender baking system, since there you can't bake multiple maps all together. I use the Principled Baker add-on. It's free and I totally love it. It speeds up the work so much. Unfortunately, the UDIMS haven't been implemented yet, but with a little workaround you can still bake your maps and save tons of time. What you need to do is basically select your objects, set up all the settings, and then launch the bake. This will bake your first tile. Add .1001 to the images names. In this way, any software that supports tiles will detect these images as first tiles and then get back to Blender. Select the creature, switch to edit mode, and go to UV editor. The problem here is that Principled Baker only exports the first tile. So what we need to do to being able to bake also the texture maps for the islands of our second tile is to move these islands to the first tile. But here comes another issue. If we do this on our active UVs, this will mess up our material since we are using them as coordinates for the masks, bump maps, and normals. Fortunately, with Principled Baker, we also have the possibility to use two different UV maps. So in this way, we can use our original UVs for the material and new ones that we will create we can use just for baking. I hope this makes sense to you. That being said, we can get back to edit mode and our UV editor. Now let's create new UV maps to avoid overwriting our original ones. Select the UVs and press GX-1. This will move your islands one tile back. Make sure the UV maps you just created are selected. Leave the main ones as active and check that in Principled Baker UV Maps menu you have selected enabled. In this way you tell Blender to use the original UVs for your original material, so the masks won't be messed up, and the new ones just for baking. Now you can bake your second UDIM tiles. Once done, add 1002 to the title of the images. Creating a second version UVs where you save the moved tiles also allows you to not having to repeat the operation every single time. Once done with the baking, I simply added the PBR maps to a clean material I created for my reptile, and I was ready for the next step. Now it was time to create a rig. I usually make very simple rigs for my projects, so no fancy controllers or anything complicated. I actually lose my patience very quickly when it comes to rigging, since I can't wait to pose and render my works. That's one of the reasons I never used Rigify. But since Zach from CG Boost made a chapter about it in his new course about creatures and published that nice video with that cool rig with all that controllers and nice widgets, I couldn't resist and decided to give it a try. As you can see, I made it. Since it was my first time and I didn't really know the logic behind the add-on, I had some troubles at first. Fortunately, I was able to solve everything thanks to the videos by Zach. At the end, I was able to create this nice rig that still feels like something incredible to me.
Thank you, Zach!
By the way, since I'm part of CG Boost team, you can have a nice 10% discount on this and other courses by CG Boost. For more info, just check out the video description. Finally, I got to the last stage where I could do a nice presentation render of my creature. I decided to create two render setups. First one would be a simple rendering with a posed creature placed on a simple plane without anything around it. This one I could use for still renderings, turnarounds, and to show all the different color variations I have created. As you can see, here I have a simple 3-point lighting with a fill light, a key light illuminating the creature from the front, and a rim light illuminating it from the back. The second one is a night scene in nature. To make it, I grabbed this branches collection by Archify 3D on Sketchfab, a few plants from Blender Kit, a grass background image from Pixabay, and arranged a scene where I posed my little reptile catching some butterflies I got from Blender Kit. The lighting is very similar to the one I have used for simple render, but here I moved the light sources a bit more to the top. The key light I turned from area to spot and moved it in a way that the legs would be less illuminated than the front part. I made the rim light a bit stronger, gave all the lights a colder tone, and added a few small lights to enhance the visibility of the glowing parts of the creature's body. I also used a few planes with leaves textures to create some slight shadows here and there. These ones I created myself by scattering some leaves on a plane and then rendering it as black and white texture. As final touch, I added some flying particles to the scene here and there. I enabled the depth of field for the camera so so the front and the back elements are out of focus. This usually helps with making things feel smaller and in general gives the scene more believability. I usually split my scenes into layers to being able to correct simple things like colors or add simple effects without necessarily having to redo the rendering. Here I have the main layer with the reptile, the branch and the butterflies. Then I have the front leaves layer, the background with all the plants and the little particles. For both renderings, I used the compositor to add some bloom to the glowing parts of the creature. For the second one, I also added some vignette effect and made the leaves in front of the camera a bit darker. So that was how I created this creature and its presentation scenes entirely in Blender. I know some steps might feel very complex and you might feel like you need more than a simple breakdown to understand how it works. In this case, this course from CG Boost about making creatures might be what you need. In this course, Zach goes through the entire process of creation and presentation of an epic creature, even including rigging and animation. I totally recommend it since I personally learned a lot from this course. Also, since I'm part of CG Boost team, you can have a nice discount. You will find the links and code in the description of this video. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If so, let me know in the comment section. I really appreciate that. And of course, same thing if you have any questions about this project. Thanks everyone for watching this video and see you in the next one. Goodbye!